Today's episode is brought to you by Sports Business Classroom. Landing a job in the NBA is no easy feat. One surefire way to put yourself in front of a competitive talent pool is if you master the collective bargaining agreement. And now you can, with a course developed by the godfather of the CBA himself, Larry Kuhn. Larry Kuhn has been teaching the CBA to teams, agents, media, and students for over 20 years, and now you can master the CBA through his online video on-demand course, which is now available to the public. If you're looking to break into basketball, or even just set yourself apart, this is the competitive advantage you are looking for. To learn more about the video on-demand course that is being taken by teams and agents all over the world, please visit sportsbusinessclassroom.com today.
Good evening, everyone. I am Aaron Washington, one of the hosts of the No Trade Clause podcast. I'm so happy to be back with everybody here on this recording for our next installment as we kind of get into the home stretch of the NBA season and we're getting into the playoffs. Here joining me on my right, if you're watching this on YouTube this evening, is Katie Heindl. If you guys haven't heard of her, she is a great writer. She has been on a variety of platforms, including Up Rocks, Slam Online, Rolling Stone, the Toronto Star, the Daily Beast. The list goes on, but you guys get the idea. She's very accomplished, and she's had several stops. Been doing work in the media center for a little bit. So, Katie, so glad to have you on this episode. Really excited to dive into a few topics with you here this evening as we get into the epic conclusion of the NBA season. It's sure to be an exciting one. So, thanks so much for your time this evening.
Of course. And thank you so much for having me, Aaron. I'm stoked to join you.
Oh, yeah. We always love bringing in guests in NTC from a variety of backgrounds. Some people have been in the coaching sector. Some people have been in management. And then other people like yourself have been in media, doing the writing scene and things like that, doing their own podcast. Mm-hmm. So to start this off, what we like to do with our guests a lot of times here on this podcast is to ask them about their prior experiences, their own stories. And I'm sure that you have a very unique story of how you came to be at this point in your writing career and how you got started. So if you don't mind, you want to take a couple of minutes and just kind of let us know how you got started in writing and what the journey has been like for you specifically as you've made your way through a variety of outlets over the years.
For sure. I mean, I had a very indirect, I guess is probably the briefest way to say, like an indirect route to basketball writing, to sports writing. I've always been a writer. I've been writing since I was a kid, big writer, big reader. Mostly kind of kept it to myself. In the past, the public facing writing I did was more kind of, like personal essays. I've done some political writing, some writing on, I guess, like more popular culture when I was working at Vice for a little while. But yeah, I have always had a day job and they were in all different fields. So I mentioned Vice. So I worked in media. I also worked in publishing for a little while. I've worked in the arts. I worked for some not-for-profit arts institutions here in Toronto, where I'm from. I worked for a little while at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, but I always, I've loved basketball since I was a kid. And as I mentioned before, I've always, found time to carve out time for writing. Usually it was early in the morning or kind of late at night. And I was a little bit hesitant to make the jump into full-time freelance writing, which was always something I saw myself moving toward, because I think when you feel yourself constantly going back to something, which is what was the case for me, and in some cases, if I'm being totally honest, like drifting away, my interest like slipping or drifting away from those other jobs that I mentioned. And always writing was the thing that took precedent. And my journey into sports writing was also fairly indirect, at least the kind of sports writing I do now. So I got started with a website called The Classical, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But David Roth, who worked at Deadspin, now he works at Defector, started that with a couple people. And it was kind of like an early prototypic Deadspin, a little bit Grantlandian, maybe like in that kind of era of sports blogging. And I wrote fiction. I wrote fictional NBA stories that were fairly loose, I'd say. Like I'm thinking of topics. One was about Paul Pierce being a vampire. Another one was about Chuck Hayes.
I've heard that one before. That's definitely different.
I mean, when you think about it a bit more, and you'll be like, I could see it. One was about Chuck Hayes driving a chuck wagon through Texas, looking for a specific restaurant that I'd read about that he really liked, and getting lost and getting overtaken by a gang of bandits led by Matt Barnes and the Plumlee brothers. So it was a very like it was super light. Like, and I think for a while, again, if I'm being totally honest, I was fairly reluctant to get into sports writing as something quote seriously, because I think there's a real lack. It's changing, but there was definitely a real lack of women's voices in that space, or the women's voices that were there were heavily critiqued. I'd say more so than men, and that still happens. But I got started writing about writing about the Raptors, actually, in a more serious way, for a blog in Toronto called Raptors Republic, that a lot of great writers have come up and through, kind of. And then it just sort of spun out from there. I got good feedback. I got more comfortable with my voice when I started to realize, what, like, there's a lot of people that write about basketball in one very specific formulaic, X's and O's kind of analytics driven way. And that's never been what I've been most comfortable with. That's not really what my natural writing voice is. And I think once I got comfortable with like being myself in that space and realizing that there was a bit of a gap and a niche that I could fill, things got a lot easier for me, I'd say. And I felt, kind of natural momentum pick up. I had some great opportunities. The timing wasn't great because the pandemic happened, but I didn't know at the time the pandemic was going to happen. But I had some great opportunities. One was being an embedded writer with the Toronto Raptors in the February before the pandemic. And I had another writer in residence role at a tech hub, at a tech startup in Toronto. So between those two things, I thought this is a good opportunity to try it full-time freelance and just write. But the pandemic turned out to work well in sports writing because everybody was stuck at home, as you know.
True. Yeah.
Yes. So it was a great opportunity to, call. I had some of my best, biggest like profiles up to that point in that stretch because, yeah, you could, call up Stan Van Gundy, you could call up Becky Hammond, you could call up like a lot of the players who were trapped at home and bored and just wanted to talk. So it worked out. That was about 2 years ago now, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
You know what, Katie, that's awesome. It definitely seems like you have a passion for this field and you tackle it from a perspective that I think people can underappreciate. There's something to be said about doing what you're doing. You were doing the fictional stories for a little bit, and a lot of people don't look at basketball in that way. It's a very non-fictional field. You look at everything from black and white, but you kind of put a different spin on it that I think people don't really look at a lot of times. And so you said you're not really into the X's and O's side of basketball, but what I've come to appreciate, and I think a lot of people will too, once they kind of get away from that a little bit, is the fact that, these players have stories of their own. They're not just people that just go on a court and robotic and just do scripted moves. I mean, they're human beings just like you and me. They have their own past. They have their own stories, their own journeys, just like you have. And it's really cool that we have people like you that take the time to talk to them and really dive into what makes them, what makes them unique. And, that what kind of brings about what happens on the court every night. So that's so awesome. And how was it for you when you got the opportunity to start interviewing these people, doing one-on-ones, doing feature stories, and kind of figuring out exactly what makes them tick? Like, was there a learning curve for you when it came to that? Having to kind of learn to speak to these people and, get that information from them. Like, how was that adjustment for you once you kind of got into that part of it?
I think there's definitely a learning curve. I mean, I think, for me, it was twofold. I think it was entering that space for the first time. I remember the first like locker room post-game interview I did. I was pretty nervous still. Like, and this was, I came from backgrounds where it was part of my day job to, cold call people, be very conversational with people. So I'm very comfortable with that side of things. But there's something about, I think, the barrier or the perceived barrier, right? Of like, one, these guys are at work, right? And you've probably in most cases just watched them do very incredible things for 2 hours, and there's like a level of intimacy too, because they're like post game, maybe they lost a game, they're feeling bad, maybe they won, they're feeling great, but they're getting changed and like they're going back to their hotel or they're going home, they're like trying to kind of leave their day job behind them. So I think navigating that space, as a woman in that space is a bit different too, because no one is awkward or weird about it, but there is an awareness, I think. But once I was comfortable with that, you just sort of realize these are conversations like you'd have with anyone else. Like you're definitely a professional, but I found the responses I got were when you sort of let the person lead Like you have your questions and your beats you want to hit, especially if, they just had an incredible game and you're writing something off that game and you've got to get a quote, or you've got to get them to mention a teammate or maybe something specific that they did on the floor that night. But otherwise, you can pretty quickly tell, what people are interested in, not interested in, the kind of ways that they may want to move the conversation, the things that may seem a little bit open-ended, and they'd be welcome for a follow-up question instead of just, blindly moving on to your next question, which can be hard to time because, as I mentioned before, nerves can be at play. Timing is a big thing. Like a lot of these guys watch the clock because they got to get to the team bus, if they're visiting those, and like they'll definitely rush you out of locker rooms in that case. But I found like for profile pieces, phone interviews, Zoom interviews, definitely a little bit easier because you've got a pretty long uninterrupted stretch of time. But I think for me, it's just, again, like approaching athletes like people, because they are, as you mentioned, like that is where a lot of my interest in their stories comes from. Even when it comes down to gameplay, like why a certain game maybe got away from someone when like the game before they were incredible, right? Or, if we're talking about the playoffs, like why one series can be so vastly different from another. Like what are the other elements at play? Like, sometimes it doesn't just come down to gameplay. I'd say, 90% of the time, it doesn't just come down to gameplay. But I think, what I've learned that some players are more comfortable just talking X's and O's. Some are comfortable, but when you kind of get them away from it, and I think they realize like, oh, I'm not going to get the same 5 questions that I always do, in a post-game situation, they seem a little bit relieved or, more engaged than they would be because you're switching it up a little bit. So I think just learning to pay attention, do your research, go back and listen to the kind of questions that they get all the time, and, trying not to hit on those same beats can really go a long way. And just, like being, I think, empathetic and open to people.
Yeah, that's a great point. You really done a great job of highlighting the humanity of these players, and one of those points you made that sticks out to me is the fact that these players, they may be great, but even the best have off nights. The things maybe outside of basketball could creep in and affect their performance from game 3 to game 4, for example, in the playoffs. And some people might see that as like, oh, they just choked or they just weltered under the pressure, when in reality, there are other factors at work that can sway players' performances from one game to the next. And one player that comes to mind for me when thinking about a performance swing within a series is Jimmy Butler. We looked at him in games 1, 2, and in the first half of 3 as being incredible. He was dropping 30 and 40 points consistently and having a great playoff run. And then he hit game 3, and after halftime, he didn't come back into the game. And luckily, Miami was able to hang on. But people had the questions like, is he right? I had the opinion that his knee was bothering him, and that's indeed why he was out of that game. But I mean, these guys, they're human. They get beat up through the playoffs. And honestly, the Heat had one of the most grueling postseasons of any team I could think of. Guys constantly going in and out of the lineup, guys being hurt, being beat down, and just trying to power through these ailments that they have. And that kind of brings me to one of the first other topics I want to discuss with you this evening, Katie, is just how the Heat are kind of bouncing back from that playoff run. And I just think about how the way they approached it, they were such warriors through the entire way. They came up short of their ultimate goal, very close to a finals berth, but we have to give them credit. They went out there, and I think of people like PJ Tucker and Jimmy Butler that powered through injuries, and they really embody what makes Heat culture so special. Guys that are just tough as nails, and they want to bring their best every night and never let up. And that's something that made me really get attached to that team. I'm one of the I would consider myself a supporter of that team, and I love watching them go to work night in and night out, even though the games may be not the greatest, not the prettiest contest where you have 130 to 135 score. It's going to be maybe 90 to 88 or something to that effect. So just wanted to touch on that with you here as we approach their off season. As we know, they were eliminated just a few days ago, and now they have some questions to answer. They were one of the more expensive teams in the league last season. I look at their salaries. I mean, they were pretty close to the luxury tax, and obviously it paid off in a big way as they almost made the finals. But now they have some difficult questions to ask. And one of the most prominent of those questions is going to be, how did they approach Tyler Hero's off season? He had a great season up until A couple of those last playoff series where he fell off and he had an injury of his own.
Mm-hmm.
But he's at the end of his rookie contract and he's looking for a raise. He's looking for a starting role. He wants to continue to progress through his career, and I get it. He's 22 and he really feels like he had a great season, which he did. He was 6th man of the year, for crying out loud. But I'm interested to see how the Heat approach his offseason. So I guess that brings me to my first question. I mean, if it were you and you're going into this offseason looking at Tyler Hero, I mean, has he done enough in your eyes to justify a starting spot over some of the other players they have on that roster? Do you think he is a Heat uniform for the long run? Because we've seen him in a lot of trade rumors. I mean, could he end up being moved for a star, or could Miami really invest in him in the long run and give him a new contract that sees him in a Miami Heat uniform for the next 4 to 5 years?
I mean, there are some rare players I think that really are drawn to or kind of magnetize that Miami Heat system that you mentioned. It's a really rigorous, really, really rigorous team, just in terms of everything from what you talked about, like their competitive nature, how I think just dogged all the guys on that team are, all the way, to like their conditioning. And a lot of players aren't necessarily a good fit. But I would say that Tyler Hero, not just by virtue of coming up within that system, but I think he's really found himself as an athlete, as a basketball player, like within that team dynamic. I think he got even better when Jimmy Butler got there, which is saying something, like I think I remember like I had my concerns because at that time, I think it was a little bit like, how serious, he's a rookie. He was a young guy. Like he was living the South Beach lifestyle, but like, and I hate that kind of rhetoric of being like, how serious is someone? But for a little while, I'm like, I don't think he's that serious. I think he wants to like, maybe enjoy himself a little bit. But Jimmy Butler got there, and those two seem to click like right away. Jimmy Butler's got his like Tyler Tuesdays shout out that he does on IG all the time. And I feel like when Jimmy Butler really warms to someone, I think that's a rare kind of nod of affection. He doesn't have that with many guys in the league. So I think I could see the Heat wanting to hang on to him. I look around the league, especially this offseason, and some of the destinations it may have looked attractive to an athlete like Tyler Hero might not so much this offseason. I think of like maybe your big ticket marquee franchises like the Lakers. I would not necessarily want to go there. You've seen what they can kind of do and how they can maybe disregard young talent in terms of their development. I think of other teams like I know we're going to talk about the Mavs, but like I think about the Mavs and they could use a shooter like Hero. But again, I think the culture perhaps is a little bit of a misfit. So I think it's one of those things that to me seems quite clear, but as you know, this is the NBA and nothing seems to ever be as it seems, especially in the off season. But I do feel like he's a great fit in Miami. My sense is that he wants to stay in Miami. That team was incredible. Like you touched on some of the injuries and they were all playing hurt and extremely hobbled. Like I'm also a Heat supporter. I'm a big Kyle Lowry fan. And just watching him kind of bust his ass and all those other guys kind of bust their butts to stay there, I was quite torn because it's like I wanted to see them advance, but I didn't want to see them advance to just get swept by the Warriors, right? Because they're not like they're where they're at right now, health wise, is just not at par with where the Warriors are, for example. So It's a bit bittersweet to see them out like that, but I think there's no reason why they can't come back improved next season without making honestly too many changes. The money is obviously an issue, but like I don't know, they've got deep pockets. It's the Heat,
They do have deep pockets. I mean, a guy named Pat Riley. Yeah, I mean, he's going to make something out of nothing. I mean, he got in Jimmy Butler and had to trade. The highlight piece of the trade was Josh Richardson. So that tells you all you need to know about his creativity when it comes to bringing in marquee players. So, I mean, I totally agree. I think their offseason, they have the building blocks are there. You have Bam, you have Jimmy. Kyle Lowry's on for 2 more seasons. So the outlines are there. I mean, this is a team that's built to win. And it's reflected in their cap numbers, their salaries. It's reflected in their culture, their mindset. So, I mean, PJ Tucker has another year. I think he opts in again. He has a player option. I'd like to see him there for another year. And one thing I have seen people kind of suggest is that he move away from a full-time starting role. He's getting into his late 30s. He's going into year 12, I believe, this coming season after spending a bunch of time overseas before that. He was he spent time in Toronto, as you know, and he's bounced around a lot. So it might be time to kind of try to preserve him for the big moments in the playoffs and not just play him, grind him down 30 plus minutes a game during the regular season. But it looks like that would necessitate some kind of deal to bring in a guy that can be a full-time starter at the 4, or at least majority of the time at the 4 to take his place. And they do have a little room to work with. They do have guys like Haslam and Dedman as free agents, and they have very cheap deals on Strus and Vincent, which that in itself is pretty incredible. You think about how they both performed in the playoffs. They're both signed for next season for less than $2 million each. So, that just says all you need to know about asset management for Miami. That's 2 really incredible deals. Caleb Martin had a great season. He's a restricted free agent. And then a guy named Oladipo is an unrestricted free agent. So, he's back on the block, and we'll see if he stays with the team. I've been a supporter of Oladipo's for a long time since he was drafted. He reminded me of Dwayne Wade, who, I love Dwayne Wade till the day I die. And he had a great season himself and great postseason moments. So I'm interested to see what Oladipo ends up doing, because if he really goes and chases as much money as he wants to, I have a hard time believing that. It's possible, but Miami is going to be a tough place for him to remain if he wants a long-term deal with several guaranteed seasons. It's going to be tricky. It's going to be tricky for sure. So they can go in a lot of different directions. That's for sure. They do have some great contracts on their books, but it's all about, do they want to go big game hunting again? I've seen guys like Donovan Mitchell being mentioned in trade rumors. Zach LaVine is out there floating around, Bradley Beal. And I think a lot of that is because it's Miami. It's a great city. It's a great organization. So by default, they're going to attract the big name stars. So we're going to have to see how that goes. But as far as Oladipo goes, do you have any thoughts about, what he could end up doing here in free agency? Does he take a little bit of a pay cut to stay in Miami because he loves it? Or is he thinking this is his last chance for a great deal? He is, about 30 years old at this point. So maybe he moves on to another team to try to get as many dollars as possible going into the latter half of his career.
Yeah, with a guy like Oladipo, I think unfortunately, just with the rough stretch that he's had with injuries, I could see him wanting to stay and taking a pay cut for the stability it could offer. Like, he's obviously comfortable in that system. They're comfortable with him. He did have some pretty I think he had some pretty good games within the playoffs. I think it was just flashes. He definitely didn't get as much consistency playing, even during the regular season, as you probably want to see. But I could see it kind of sucks because the Heat are a little bit of a ruthless organization, right? By virtue of I think the way that I also think they kind of pride themselves on it because they want to win.
Oh yeah, at all costs.
And I think as you mentioned, they've got these Jimmy, Bam, I think Kyle to a degree, PJ, though I do disagree with you a little bit, just because I think it would be very hard for PJ Tucker to take a backseat role. You know what I mean? And maybe he's lost a little bit on his quickness, but his physicality is still there. I think his reads are still incredibly good, and they don't necessarily need him to fill that spot. If you, as you mentioned, Strauss and some other guys are they're younger, they're faster, a little bit fresher. I think you'd be hard pressed to ask PJ to tone it down, which is a great problem to have.
Yeah, it only describes him very much.
But because of that, I do wonder, if the front office there could see as Oladipo being a player they could potentially either package for someone else. I question going big star hunting just because of fits. Chemistry fits. I don't actually think Zach LaVine would be a bad fit at all, but I also like him very much in Chicago. So I don't necessarily. Yeah. He seems very happy there. And that team also got a really bad break when it came to just injuries in the second part of the season. I don't think they need to make a ton of changes, but with the Heat, I do wonder if they could see Victor Oladipo as kind of the expendable one on that roster. Again, this is not me talking. This is more the ruthlessness and the shrewdness of Pat Riley. So, we'll see. I'm with you. I want him to land somewhere where he can just play. I just want to see him play consistently again.
for sure. I mean, he did some great things for that team, and patience was rewarded both from his end and the team's end, waiting for him to get 100% healthy, and it paid dividends. And I remember in the last part of the regular season, he had a few games where he really kind of burst back on the scene with 30 plus points, and it's like, wow, I mean, he's really returning to form. It's so cool to see. And this shot creation was, a huge asset to the Miami Heat team, and they really could have used some of that offense in that series against Boston. They kind of fell flat on that end. But that's something they'll definitely address in the offseason. And that's part of the reason why people are rumoring big stars to go there, because they can provide that kind of mix something out of nothing offense that guys like Brown and Tatum were able to provide on the Celtics side. That sometimes is lacking on the Heat side. And another team that, really needed somebody of that caliber to kind of join them during the season was the Dallas Mavericks. And they also had an unfortunate end to their season. But I think that trade way back near the trade deadline to bring in Spencer Dinwiddie paid dividends. And he had his ups and downs. But in the end, I mean, he did some great things for that team. And Bertans had his moments as well. So I think the Mavericks have nothing to be ashamed of losing that series to a very formidable team in Golden State. A guy like Luka is cream of the crop, and they had some great pieces around him that at sometimes came up a little short, but ultimately that team is built very well, and they're going into an off season where there's some big questions here, and they have some key concerns, weaknesses to address. So looking at their situation, they have a little bit more wiggle room than Miami. They have less of those huge contracts on their books. And with the caveat that Luka is coming up on a big pay raise. I mean, he's going from $10 million to $36.6 million in the first year of his extension. So I will make that point. He's getting a huge pay raise. But you look at the other contracts, and the next highest paid player is Tim Hardaway Jr. at $19 million, which, interestingly enough, that's a decrease from this season. So his contract is a good one if someone wants to trade for it. And they're another team that's been linked to people in the past. And this season, this offseason coming up, I think they're going to look at a guy like Rudy Gobert. That's a name that's been brought up for them, because that's a hole that Golden State was able to exploit, not having rim protection, not having rebounding. I mean, they got rebounded so bad in some of those games where it was an incredible deficit. So looking at the Mavericks situation, what I'm not sure how much of that series you're able to watch, but does anything stand out to you in particular about what they can target in free agency, any deficiencies, weaknesses that they have that they really need to zero in on if they really want to build a contender around Luka, who is one of the best players, and you just don't want to waste his prime here as he takes more and more steps towards being one of the best players in the NBA?
I mean, I think one of the big gaps I noticed in that series was unfortunately a player that they do have that just was hurt is Tim Hardaway Jr. Like they really missed his shooting. He is one of the best shooters they have. I think he's one of the best success stories in the NBA in terms of just like a guy who has really toggled and kind of like fine-tuned his game as he's, like season over season, and put the work in, and has actually just like dug into himself and like fixed, like not every athlete, like not every person is really able to do that. And for him to become pretty much just like, I'd say, the most dependable shooter that team has, they missed him hugely. I think in that series, especially because like when they got, when they get in a hole, they couldn't shoot their way out of it. And obviously like a team like the Warriors is able to do something like that. So, but I'm glad that you mentioned Gobert too. I think the Gobert fit is interesting to me mostly because he doesn't necessarily seem quite happy in his current situation.
No, he does not.
Yeah. So the Mavs could, look to capitalize on that. I think he'd be eager to take not a drastic pay cut, but I think when, someone wants to leave and start fresh, they're kind of willing to leave a little bit of money on the table. I think Gobert could do that in this case. It strikes me as strangely a good, like the Mavs are a weird like front office team. They are a weird like chemistry team, but I think that Gobert would probably fit into that organization fairly well. Otherwise, like, and I'm a bit remiss to say this because I am not necessarily a Mavs fan, but I feel like they don't have that much to do. They had a string of bad luck with injuries. You get Hardaway Jr. back. you kind of you try and make up for that deficit of rebounding around the rim. And I think with like turnovers too, and you're plugging some holes already, and like this Mavs team is a little bit of a slow burner. Like they've had a lot of these guys for a couple seasons now and nothing really seemed to click. You get a new head coach this season that seems to give them some new momentum, and like they've obviously, like Jason Kidd is, out to his credit, I think more of a creative coach in the latter half of the season than I expected.
Same here.
Yeah. So I think, when you put all that stuff together, like this is not a situation where you need to trade away half the team to go out and get a big star and just kind of like keep your fingers crossed that they're going to change everything. Because in a lot of cases that would make it worse. And I think in the Mavs case it would too. So I think rim protection is the one main thing, but you also might they might be able to do that by not getting a superstar,
True. Yeah. I mean, there are other centers out there that can provide that type of role, that type of contribution without being superstars. I think of a guy like Mitchell Robinson, for example. He's been one of the great shot blockers in our league for a few years since he was drafted. And I mean, he's going to be a free agent, but he's not going to command anywhere near the type of salary that Gobert does. Gobert is, well over $30 million per season. And Mitchell Robinson, I'm thinking he'll be in the teens, due to his lack of offense and some other deficiencies he has, his lack of consistency. So that's a good point. I mean, they don't have to go big game hunting and try to find the biggest fish in the pond at that position. They can go a little bit smaller, a little bit more low key. The two guys that have been occupying that position at center, Kleba and Powell, I mean, they make about $20 million combined. So, you look at those guys, they're not big stars, and they filled in admirably this season and in prior seasons. You touched on it, the fact that some of these guys in the Mavericks roster have been there for a few years. Powell and Kleba fit the bill. Dorian Finney-Smith has been there for a little bit. So they definitely have some guys that know their way around the Mavericks organization. So that's definitely a great point. I will say that I think the Gobert and Luka pairing would be interesting because think about their mental, the mental aspect of it, the way that Gobert conducts himself, the way that Luka conducts himself. They're both very competitive players, extremely competitive. I look at Gobert; he takes losses extremely hard. Luka does as well. They want to win at all cost. So I think they could really find a bond there. And I keep thinking about what you had touched on at the beginning of our broadcast, which is the human side of these players. Sometimes it's not always about just everything as far as the X's and O's. I mean, basketball, a lot of it is a mental game. So these two guys could find common ground on and off the court, and that helps them to gel even better when it comes to running pick and rolls, Gobert catching lobs and things like that. So I agree. They don't have to go big game hunting, but the fan in me, just the guy that just wants organized chaos at all times, or even just chaos in general, would love to see those two guys share the court at some point next season. So I wouldn't be mad if it happens, but yeah, they definitely don't have to do that. And I mean, they have wiggle room when it comes to Maxi Kleba. Maybe they move off of him. He's not guaranteed for $9 million and go in a different direction. But I'm looking at the cap sheet here, and there's not a lot of guys going to free agency. There's a couple of non-guarantees. There's Trey Burke for a player option. But, I mean, a lot of these contracts are locked in. They're guaranteed. So I don't think we're going to see a huge wave of moves. I agree with you on that front. Just a lot of guys that are going to go into their second year with the Mavericks. They're going to be even better. Tim Hardaway Jr. is going to return. And Jason Kidd, wow. I mean, let's give a round of applause to Jason Kidd, the job that he did. I don't know about you, but he came into this season here as the leader of this team, as a coach, and I was pessimistic. I thought that he would make the same mistakes as he did in Brooklyn, as he did in Milwaukee, and hamstring this team. But he did the opposite, especially on the defensive end. Defensively, they were way better than I thought they were going to be, and that's what allowed them to make the jump to the conference finals. So kudos to that team on that front. And be watching their offseason closely. There might not be a lot of action there, but they do have the fundamental building blocks to make this thing work as Luka goes into, I guess, the prime of his career into year 5. So that's going to be fun to watch no matter what they do, just because Luka is that big of a star. And he proved it on the big stage again against one of the best teams in the league. So, can't discount Luka and the impact that he's going to have for this team for hopefully a long time.
Yeah. And we didn't mention him, but I think of a guy, I don't actually like this because I like him a lot in Portland, but I do think of a guy like Nurk too. I think Nurkic could be like a good, because I think he's available this summer.
He is. Yes,
yeah, and that he his demeanor might fit in a little bit better there. Like what you're saying about Gobert and Luka, I think that competitive thing is definitely true, but I wonder about like the merging of those personalities, big
Yeah,
personalities,
yeah,
right? And Nurkic is he just seems a bit more on the level.
he is. He is. He's kind of he brings them a little bit more order, stability to the team instead of those other guys, which they just thrive off of chaos. So definitely a lot of different personalities in that regard. So interested to see how they approach their offseason. There's definitely an element of intrigue there with Luka. But I mean, they were eliminated by the Golden State Warriors. I mean, the Golden State Warriors are representing the Western Conference in the NBA Finals. So we have to wind this podcast down with a little bit of a preview on the upcoming NBA Finals. It's going to be an extremely awesome battle between two very dominant defensive teams. They're both top 3 in defensive rating in the regular season, which is very impressive. I think Golden State even finished ahead of the Heat in that regard. So I'd expect to see more grinded out games, maybe not as fierce and as brutal as Miami and Boston. I mean, that was just an all-out war every single game. But in any case, it's going to be very exciting because of the matchups going back and forth on each side. I mean, Smart and guarding Curry, Draymond guarding Tatum, Brown, vice versa. Wiggins, let's see if he can keep his rise. That's going to be really interesting to kind of follow. But a little bit of backstory, Golden State won their first matchup in December by 4. So that was 111 to 107. But Thompson and Poole were absent from that game. So that's a key difference here. Their second matchup, Boston took that game 110 to 88. So it was a straight blowout. But that was the game that Curry injured his ankle. And that was due to Marcus Smart diving for a loose ball and rolled up on his ankle and caused Curry to miss the rest of the regular season going into the playoffs. Steve Kerr called it a dangerous play. Kerr wasn't a fan of that at all. So there might be a little bit of tension on this series kind of stemming from that matchup. But Tatum and Brown did combine for 52 points in that game. So I think what I'm trying to say here is there's not a ton that we can take from the regular season that would apply here because there are some people missing, but it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. And I have a question for you when it comes to, we know what the stars are going to do. We know what Curry and Tatum, these guys are going to bring to the table. But what about the supporting cast? What about some of the guys coming off the bench? I mean, the benches, as we see in these playoffs, are very important. So if you're going to look at Boston, you're going to look at Golden State, X factors, who can have a huge impact on the series? Maybe that is not a starter, not a guy that's going to play 35 minutes a game. There's a lot of candidates here, but I'm interested to see who you might think will stand out to make themselves known on that second unit for each team.
When I think of the Warriors, I kind of automatically think about Jonathan Kuminga. He's a guy who I think Steve Kerr was a bit reluctant to play earlier in the playoffs, it seemed like, which surprised me a little bit because he's had some phenomenal games this season and just some great growth. I think, for a rookie, he is fairly collected, fairly calm, fairly collected, good reads. He has the trust of his teammates. Again, like I feel like that's a rare compliment for a guy like Draymond Green, but like he does have the trust of his teammates. So I'd be curious to see how he could kind of come in a couple, breather minutes for the starters. And he could be a difference maker because he's not just a guy that's going to come in and tread water. You know what I mean? Like he's also a bit of a high flyer. He's a really physical player. I think that's going to be important because you look at Boston and the series are the bigger team. So the Warriors are they're going to need that muscle, I think it's going to be, Klay Thompson said it was going to be a dogfight, I think earlier today. And I got to agree with that. Like I could see it becoming a little bit contentious, not necessarily because of that injury, but of course, like stuff like that lingers. But just because of these two franchises, right? Like these are the Warriors have like made themselves into kind of a marquee franchise, and the Celtics have always, much to a lot of fans' chagrin, have always had that title, right? So, I could see, and it's like if it's Kuminga's first time on this stage, and I think he definitely would have something to prove. When I think of the Celtics, it's funny. Like when I think of the Celtics, I guess got Peyton Pritchard, but I think more of the core because we've just like they've come together they have done the rare thing that I think that teams do when they win championships, which is evolve through every single series that they play and win.
Mm.
Like this Boston team is not the same team that you saw in round one. Like they're completely different the way that they're playing. I think the way that they're playing with one another, they're super banged up too, but you don't really see it coming to bear out on the floor. It's going to be tough.
It's going to be extremely so. Extremely so.
Who do you think for Boston, like a difference maker?
For Boston, I had Derek White as my X factor for them.
Yeah.
I look at Derek White's performance against the Heat, and he really stepped up his aggressiveness. I remember the round previous against Milwaukee, he was hesitant to shoot at times, and they were okay with leaving him open, ducking under screens, because Derek White is not the strongest shooter. He's a middling, low to mid 30% shooter typically in his career, anywhere from 31 to 33%.
Mm-hmm.
But he got a lot more bold against the Heat. He took threes and made threes, and that was a huge difference. So he brought something to the table aside from his great defense, his great steady presence as a ball handler. He was aggressive. He got to the hole at times. So I think that's the big thing for Derek White that he displayed, is just his aggressiveness. He really pushed, he forced the issue. Because I think when Miami saw in that game that Marcus Smart was out,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit in their minds, just a little bit, even the Heat got in this trap thinking like, Marcus Smart is out. We can relax. We can be cool with the ball. We can get a little creative with our ball handling. And Derek White was like, I mean, I've been a starter. I was a starter in San Antonio under Pop. I mean, I have experience. I'm that guy. So he came out and really brought it to the Heat. And I think that was a big reason why that was one of those games that Boston won, because he made himself known to such a degree that it allowed the Stars to kind of play their game without having to worry about carrying an extra load. So Derek White is definitely that guy for me I'm going to be looking at, and I'm hoping that wasn't an aberration, because if he's going to go off against Miami, I'm like, I better see that against the Golden State, the same aggressiveness, that same shot making for sure. And on the Golden State side, I mean, a guy that was superb against the Mavericks, Kevon Looney.
Oh, yeah.
He was impressive. And I didn't notice. Did you know that 20-point game that he had in that series against the Mavericks was his first 20-point game since college?
I did not know that. That seems surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand it because he's not exactly a scoring type guy. He's gonna just do the dirty work. But still, I mean, not just not score 20 points in the first several years of your career in the NBA. That's saying something. So I'm watching him specifically, not necessarily his scoring, because that was icing on the cake for Golden State, but it's more of his rebounding. He had 20 rebound games against the Mavericks, and that was one of the reasons why the differential in rebounding was so great, was because he was so dominant on the glass, creating second chances. I mean, that's a death sentence against Golden State. If they get second and third opportunities to score with guys like Clay, Poole, and Curry on the roster, you're just kind of out of luck. So that's definitely a guy I want to look at to have another big series. And he's going to be huge. I mean, they're going up against Robert Williams, Al Horford, who was superb against the Heat. He's going to have a much more difficult task. All due respect to Powell and Kleba. They're great players, but they're not Horford and Robert Williams, especially when it comes to rim protection. So those are two of the guys I'm going to have the magnifying glass on to see if they can replicate their performance against those teams that they faced in the previous round. Derek
White is definitely a good one to keep your eye on for a difference maker. I'd say especially if he can keep up the kind of shot creation that he had in the Miami series, because that's something that I think Golden State will try and put pressure on him pretty quickly for that. So whether he kind of stumbles under their pressure. I mean, defensively, obviously Boston is at the advantage here. But I don't know. A part of me wondered if maybe the Celtics had the advantage because the Warriors have been here so many times. So not to say that they've like coasted to this place, because nobody does. This is the finals. But just in terms of like the different energies and perhaps mentalities going into it. But then I found a stat that was like Golden State, I think, has the best record for teams that have trailed by the end of the third to come back and win. So like that theory of mine went out the window.
I mean, we've seen epic comebacks in the playoffs before. So, that's definitely something I'm going to be watching. If a team goes up by 15 or 20, don't count them out. We've seen,
especially these two, I think.
Absolutely. And I mean, something else I'm going to keep an eye on is how does Golden State approach their offense? Because the things that they did in that previous series against the Mavericks not going to carry over. Obviously, Boston is a lot more versatile when it comes to their defense. You'll see Robert Williams and Hal Horford go on the perimeter and guard point guards. I mean, they're that confident. They're that capable defensively. Warriors couldn't really do that. I mean, they would go and hunt Bertans. They would go hunt Powell, because when Poole or Curry got one of those guys, I mean, it was an instant rim attack, and that opened up the floor for everybody else. So I'm going to be keying in on those guys and also how they look on the court physically. I had heard earlier today from, I think it was Ime Udoka, was saying that Robert Williams is going to be questionable every single game of the series. So there is no guarantee he's going to play every game. And then Marcus Smart is available. But as we saw, I mean, he was banged up bad. Missed a couple of games of that previous series against Miami. He has an ankle injury that looked horrific in real time. And he's really banged up. So, I mean, is he up for a challenge chasing Curry around the court all day long? I'm not sure. I mean, not that many people are when they're healthy, but with Smart, it's I mean, that's an added element of things that we have to keep an eye on. So that's definitely something I want to kind of want to look at. But I mean, these two teams have great history. They've been here several times, not exactly recently, but if you're looking at one of these teams to further solidify their history, their legacy, to go out here and add another championship to their mantle, what is your professional yet slightly opinionated take on who could take home this year's Larry O'Brien trophy?
This is tough. My gut kind of says Celtics, just because of what I mentioned before, the way they've been on this rise. And I think that defensive element, they know how to wear teams down. You know, they really do know how to wear teams down. But again, like the antithesis of that is a team is made of historic 3-point shooters, right? So like you've got, like they kind of know each other's Achilles heels very well, I would say. But I'm also curious, like, to see how someone like Andrew Wiggins plays. You know, I could actually see him more than Draymond guarding Tatum, because he did such a good job in that last series, right? With like Luka. And I think that Kerr could want to utilize him in those positions a little bit more. And I do think he's got something to prove, you know, in terms of like, what does the next generation of the Golden State Warriors look like? You know, like the kind of big three. They're by no means like past their prime, but they've got to look to the future. So I guess my professional, but biased, very professional, not emotional at all, very biased opinion. Actually, it isn't very biased, because I don't root for either of these teams secretly or like, you know, out loud. But there is just something about the Celtics team. You know, they just kind of feel due for it. They've been on a bit of a slow burn. I think Ime Udoka has had a phenomenal season as a coach. Wow. It's so cool to see how successful he's been with this team and the way that they've kind of changed almost instantly in his hands. It's just like someone who can see all the little gaps and has like kind of watched from afar and then steps into the role and is like, just change these few things. And then the team like plays completely different. So yeah, I think it's Boston, because you also have to look at the past. Like I think of the bubble playoffs. I think of like probably the past 5 seasons when the Celtics, they've been this team in the East that is just almost gotten there, but like couldn't quite get out of the East, you know? And teams can only do that for so long before you've got to go back to the drawing board and either like blow them up, start from scratch, you know, or just say like, all right, like they didn't have it for whatever reason, or maybe the matchups were just too tough. The conference was too good. They couldn't get out of it. And I think the Celtics have been feeling that pressure pretty acutely, because they watched Toronto do it. They watched Toronto get out. They watched the Bucks get out. I mean, no one's watched the Sixers do it yet, but you know, the Celtics are the other team. I think when I think of that group of teams that have just struggled for so long to just like, they make it to one point in the playoffs and then like, that's as far as they can go. And the Celtics have already gotten past that. So to me, it feels like that they want the whole thing.
Oh yeah. I mean, This will be a monumental turnaround for Boston. It's easy to forget that at the beginning of 2022, they were a 500 team.
Mhm.
They were in the play-in tournament
Mhm.
as late as January. And then Jaylen Brown, I think it was mid-January, put out a tweet saying the energy is about to shift.
Mhm.
Boy, did it shift in a big way. Now they're on the biggest stage in basketball. So, yeah, for Boston, I mean, they definitely have that chip on their shoulder. As you said, they came up very close. They were in Game 7 a few years ago against LeBron's Cavs and dropped that game. So they've been right there. They see the opening here. They know that nothing is guaranteed, even with star wings like Tamin Brown. They got to take advantage. So
Mhm.
I think that they're going to have a great chance to win this series. It's very tough to select a winner here because you're looking at both teams, how they perform, and the way they have that star power at the top, followed by a lot of great depth and great coaching. I'm going to be following the X's and O's very closely in this series because both coaches are superb. Ime Udoka deserves a lot of credit. He's a rookie head coach that's in
Mhm.
NBA Finals. That's pretty special. So credit to him for getting his team to this point, making that turnaround midseason. So they have a great chance to win. Golden State can't. It's hard to go against Golden State. I've seen a lot of experts say that they're picking Golden State in 7 games. I can see that. And, maybe it just comes down to they're healthier. They're a little bit fresher. They've had more rest going into game 1. It's very minor, but that can make the difference
Mhm.
with teams this evenly matched at this level of basketball. So,
And the experience too, I think, right? Like you
sure.
can't discount that. If we want to talk professionally, it feels a bit stupid to bet against Steph Curry.
I mean, it does. It
But
does.
I
Because
guess
he's
I
done
did.
this before
Yeah.
many times. But yeah, it's going to be fascinating to kind of watch this play out from both sides. Just the great defense is great defense, but you hear it said all the time. Great offense will beat great defense every day. So maybe at some point Curry just says, I don't care what you throw at me. I'm going to be Curry. And that's that. That could swing a game or two, and that can be all it takes to kind of take it home. So
I think he wants that MVP trophy
I
too.
think he does.
Yeah.
The one thing he's missing on that trophy shelf is
Mhm.
Finals MVP. So if he can go out there and secure that, I mean, his resume is pretty complete at that point. He's got everything you can ever want in a basketball career. So very fascinating series. Any last thoughts about how this can turn out going into game 1 tomorrow?
I hope it's not an acrimonious series. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of passion and like it'll be heated in that way, but I hope it doesn't turn into anything more. It's been a weird playoffs for that a little bit, so I hope it's going to be competitive no matter what. So it's going to be definitely fun to watch, but yeah, I hope, I don't know. That's also might be unrealistic to say, well, I hope everybody stays
Let's
friends.
just all play nice. We're all
Yeah.
friends here. Let's just have a good time, play basketball. We don't need anything hostile.
I don't want to, I want everybody to stay healthy. I'm
Oh
going to
yeah, 100%,
for that
100%.
because that's just like, it's been a rough with COVID and then with injuries, like it's been a rough year for everybody. So
It has.
yeah.
It has.
Yeah.
Yeah, I second that. I'm hoping for a clean, healthy series. Very intense, very passionate, but healthy. We want everybody
Yes.
healthy for sure. So we're going to wind things down here, Katie. This has been a great conversation, kind of hearing about your past and then looking at the future of a couple of teams and the current playoff series that we're going into here. All and very insightful points that you made here. So thanks again for offering your time to the podcast. Great having you on here. And we are looking forward to seeing you out in Vegas here in just another month or so. NBA Summer League, Sports Business Classroom, who sponsors this podcast, will be out there. And we love to just kind of give them a little bit of shout out at every episode because they're the big reason why I'm here. John is here. Some of the other contributors, No Trade Clause. We all got our start through Sports Business Classroom. Some of us last year, some of us the year before. In any case, they give a great platform for people like me that are basketball junkies, people like you, to get their foot in the door. And Katie is actually going to be one of the featured speakers next month at the basketball, the immersive experience. So if you guys are considering it, maybe the appearance of Katie at that event will swing you to making the purchase, making the dive to check that out. But yeah, we just definitely want to plug them because it's a great resource. It's a great time. So check them out at sportsbusinessclassroom.com. They also have social platforms, and you guys can learn how you can get involved in that program that's coming up very quickly here in next month here, middle of July. But until then, Katie, I think we're going to sign out here. Thanks again so much, and best of luck with everything you have going on, all your projects and everything. We'll be watching, and can't wait to see what you got coming up next year in the writing sector.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like it was one of the most level-headed conversations I've had around the NBA playoffs, which is saying something. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, I have you fooled, because when it comes to the NBA and the playoffs, a lot of times I'm far from level-headed. So, especially in the Miami series, that was intense. But thanks so much, Katie, and thanks so much for you guys for checking out this podcast. Keep it locked here. We have more content coming at your way real soon. But until then, we'll sign out here. Take care, everybody.
My name is Larry Kuhn, and I'm the General Manager and Lead Instructor of Sports Business Classroom. I'm inviting you to participate in a unique opportunity to break into basketball. Sports Business Classroom is immersed in the NBA Summer League in Las Vegas, Nevada. And when I say immersed, I mean we're right there in the arena, bringing NBA movers and shakers into our classroom and putting you right into the Summer League action. Sports Business Classroom is the best of all worlds. Great academics, challenging assignments, hands-on work at Summer League, and the chance to start building your network of league connections. It's an experience you can get nowhere else. Have you ever dreamed of working in NBA basketball? Don't just wish it will happen, make it happen. Space is limited, so jumpstart your career today by visiting sportsbusinessclassroom.com.